Well, hello there. Today we've got something to tell about. The NATO-Ukraine meeting is expected no invitation right now, but there's an active debate, and that's already a victory of some sort. As well as the stretched Russian economy that is working out at the very maximum with one sole purpose: not to collapse after immense war spending that goes on for 3 years and will eat out up to 40% of the Russian budget this year. This and more in our daily episode. We see that Russian economy is in a very dire state, the new high diplomat of the European Union, Kaja Kallas, stated while visiting Kyiv in her new role. Kallas' visit, together with that of the new European Council President Antonio Costa, was a sign that, at least for now, the EU will attempt to keep Ukraine's economy and military industry in shape. The Russian economy, in fact, has experienced several challenges over the past few months, with a record high interest rate unable to stop the inflation, set to around 10% in 2024. The US government, on November 21st, decision to impose new sanctions on dozens of Russian banks has added insult to injury for the country's economy, with the value of the ruble dropping over 10% within a week, hitting an exchange rate of 113 rubles for $1. In 2025, Russia will spend around 40% of its budget on the country's defense sector, in fact, for war. Tanks, heavy equipment, hundreds of missiles. All of this requires tens of thousands of workforce that have high salaries, and the cost of materials production, sanctions bypassing. Economy is not made of rubber. It stretches as far as physically it can, and then it explodes unexpectedly with unexpected consequences.
If you think about the interest rate of the Russian bank, it's 21%. Their national fund is completely depleted. They can't get the revenues from the gas that they used to get. And they have a very difficult situation with the employment market because everything is going to the military industry. We also need to discuss how we can proceed with the use of frozen assets, because it's clear that we have the Russian frozen assets, and it's clear that Russia is causing all the damages to Ukraine, so it should be also Russia that pays for those damages. Kaja Kallas, High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy.
You cannot increase military spending endlessly, and the clause usually tears at the weakest point. In case of Russia, we are yet about to witness it. I'm not saying that Ukrainian economy is at its peak. After all, Russia has destroyed and destroys entire parts of Ukraine's industry. GDP is falling, and the best of the best specialist workers, IT developers, economists die on the battlefield in the ranks of Ukraine's defense forces. Both our economy and Russia's are at their limits, but with one big difference. Russians can stop the war, an invasion, anytime, and we simply cannot give up. Ukraine will not agree to other security guarantees rather than NATO, or a similar level of international safety. At least the Ukrainian MFA states so officially on its website, reminding the world about Budapest Memorandum that was signed 30 years ago and had security guarantees promised instead of the nuclear arsenal that Ukraine posed back then. Political writes that Nordic countries have suggested that Germany's division during the Cold War, where the western part of the country joined NATO while the east was under Soviet control, could become a role model for Ukraine. Western Ukraine would be aligned to the west and potentially join NATO, while the Russian-occupied provinces in the east would, for now, stay outside. End of quote. It's quite interesting formulation. Eastern and Western Ukraine, provinces rather than regions. This really resonates with Russian narrative of division of Ukraine to the west and east, allegedly that eastern part of our country is more favorable to Russian occupation. That is not true, as most fearsome fighters against the Russian evil come from all regions of Ukraine, including occupied territories, including occupied since 2014. As Deutsche Welle sources pointed out, there is still no consensus in NATO on the invitation to join the alliance which Kyiv is seeking as a possible security guarantee, but nevertheless, the Ukrainian delegation is expected to raise the issue at the NATO-Ukraine Council meeting that was held today, as part of the ministerial meeting in the evening of December 3rd. For Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiga, this will be the first meeting with his NATO colleagues. The alliance's Secretary General Mark Rutte will also meet with foreign ministers for the first time. For US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, this event will be the last in this format, as the next one will take place after the change of the US administration in Washington. According to Le Monde publication, the countries that are for inviting Ukraine to NATO are currently France and the UK, and against are the USA, Germany, Hungary, Slovakia, Belgium, Slovenia, and Spain.
And also, I read with me very interesting paper. I even don't want to use a term documents. Here is a Budapest memorandum. Here is a Budapest memorandum, and these days we mark 30 years of this paper. It's a true evidence, it's a true reminder that any long-term decisions on long-term security on the cost of Ukrainian security are inappropriate and unacceptable.
And the main question is not only Ukraine. NATO Secretary General has addressed the hybrid and hostile actions of Russia and China against NATO nations. What we can hear from the Secretary General himself, the alliance is aware of that and is full of resolve to stand back to that. But what that stand back and response will be, I cannot even predict, because we see that some governments of NATO countries, like Slovakia, are for restoring normal communication with Russia, and Hungary even allows hundreds of Russians allegedly to work at the Russian-built nuclear power plant. All of those people are potential spies that will try to infiltrate other NATO countries, and the spy network for subversive activity is spreading.
Tomorrow, ministers will address Russia's hostile actions in NATO countries. Over the past years, Russia and also China have tried to destabilize our nations with acts of sabotage, cyber attacks, and energy blackmail to intimidate us. None of these actions will deter us from supporting Ukraine or making our own defenses stronger. NATO allies will continue to stand together to face these threats through a range of measures, including greater intelligence sharing and better protection of our critical infrastructure.
Well, as expected, the NATO is not ready to invite Ukraine, though some major players like the UK and France vote for the invitation. And that's already a great success, from the never even think about Ukraine and NATO to some countries still vote against Ukraine's membership, don't you agree? Also today I have the opportunity to talk about the Middle East question, Syria in particular, with Mr. Krzyżanowski. Greetings.
Hello, it's nice to be here.
It's nice to meet you again. And on the previous time when we met, we were talking about Iran and its influence in the Middle East. And today we are talking about Syria. And serious turmoil is happening there. There's complete mess right now. Yesterday is too early, tomorrow is too late. So the rebels act now. The rebels against the Assad regime. What are the odds for their victory?
They have chance to topple down the regime, as they were able to do blitzkrieg-style offensive, and then were able to conquer Aleppo in just a few hours without any significant defense from the side of government forces. The rebels continued their advances toward the southern part of Syria. At the moment, they are trying to capture the city of Hama, which is almost the last big city, except city of Homs, before Damascus itself. And capturing Hama and later Homs would divide the territory holding by the Damascus government into two parts: the let's say desert part and the coastal part. It would be a catastrophe from the strategic point of view for the regime. So, as it is too early to say that the Syrian government of Bashar al-Assad is in imminent danger of collapse, but the situation is very, very serious.
Will the Syrian escalation, let us call it like that favorites word escalation, helped the Ukrainian front, as Bashar al-Assad is supported by Russia, and it was Russian forces and Russian aviation that helped him conquer and destroy Aleppo back in 2015 and 2016.
For sure, every defeat of Russian forces is a good thing from Ukraine, because even if it will not disperse, it will not divide a huge number of Russian troops from Ukrainian front to Syria, it would be a severe blow for morale of Russia and its supporters. And seeing Russian defeat will surely be helpful for Ukraine. Although I don't think Russia will send additional troops to Syria. Maybe a few hundreds with few airplanes, but nothing more, as the main bulk of the Russian forces are fighting in Ukraine.
And maybe let's tell our audience about the differences that caused the war in Syria. Maybe about the Alawite government of Bashar al-Assad and his clan, because they are Alawite Muslims, and the rebels, which are primarily Sunni denomination. Can you please tell us a little bit about those differences?
Syria is a very complicated country, as it is a huge mix of various religious minorities. The dominant religion in Syria is Sunni Islam, but there is also a significant portion of Shias and Alawites. Alawites are considered by radical Islamists, especially radical Sunnis, as heretics, and one of the main slogan of the rebel forces from HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which is leading an offensive toward Hama right now, is to get rid of heretic or so-called kuffar government from Syria and to establish Islamic society in Syria. That's one of the main reasons why the Bashar al-Assad government was able to secure support from various minorities. Of course, the Alawitism itself, but also Druzes, Shias, and various Christian denominations present in Syria, as they were simply afraid of Sunni jihadism. They were simply afraid that after the victory of rebel coalition, they will start ethnic, or to be more precise, religious cleansing on the Syrian territory. And sure, in the few past years, we witnessed the various atrocities made by the rebel forces. Of course, we cannot say that the government in Damascus is the good one, as they were killing many civilians also. The war in Syria is especially bloody and especially complicated, and most probably the conflict will not be end very soon.
It's very interesting because I've interviewed another expert from Israel, Igal Levin, and he is assured that most of the minorities in Syria are against the Assad regime because he introduced repressions both against Sunnis, against Christians, and other denominations of Muslims, except for Shiites and Alawites. And because they are Alawites with Shiite, they've got Iranian support, which is like a leader of the Shiite world from Tehran. What do you think about that?
That's at least partially correct. Being, let's call, a representative of the minority meant that Assad was forced to oppress the Sunni majority, especially radical jihadi groups, and those Assad supporters from minorities, especially Druzes and Christians, don't love him. so to say, but they afraid jihadists more than Assad. Their support to the government in Damascus is poorly tactical one, not based on some kind of sentiment. And that's correct, as Alawites are considered, as I said before, as heretic organization by Sunni radicals. They are not considered as such by most of Shias, and they are considered as kind of Shia group. So their relations with Iran were easier to maintain, although the Iranian support to Bashar al-Assad is not motivated by the religious issue, but the regional policy. Syria was since at least late 70s part of anti-Western bloc, and remained as such. So the cooperation between Damascus and Tehran is dated back before the Arab Spring and civil war in Syria. But the civil war and Iranian assistance during it made Bashar al-Assad dependent on Iranian aid and Iranian support and Iranian-backed militias. And Syria is at the moment very important part of Iranian so-called axis of evil, as it is easy to spot on the map. Syria is a very important part of the land road between Iran and Lebanon, and Iran is widely used Syrian territory to transport the weapon and ammunition and other types of military equipment to Lebanon for Hezbollah to use it against Israel.
So you're telling me that Syrian territory was much like a gray zone where one-sided weapons became neutral and then acquired by Hezbollah. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
And maybe can you tell me what is the American interest in Syria? Because there is American contingent as well as Turkish. So two NATO states are on the ground in Syria, helping some sides, probably helping the rebels right now. What is their interest?
The very interesting thing is that, as you said, two NATO countries are supporting opposing forces, both from the side of the rebels, but fighting against each other also, because it is important to say that rebels are not unified. They are at least four major groups of rebels. One of them, so-called Syrian National Army, is directly supported by Turkey, and that organization fights against Syrian defensive forces, mainly Kurdish forces, which are supported by United States. United States placed its ground and air forces in Syria to help in fight against the Islamic State. And at the moment, they are trying to stop, or at least to suppress, movement of Iranian equipment and militias heading to Damascus and trying to help President Bashar al-Assad.
So can we sum up that there's the group that is radical Sunni rebels, there's the group that is supported by the United States, the Kurds from Syria, and also the Turkish-backed group, right?
That's true. There are four major formations. Of course, first of all, the government in Damascus, supported by Iran and Russia. The second most important rebel group is so-called Hayat Tahrir as-Sham, the Organization for Liberation of Syria, based in Idlib province. and loosely supported but not controlled by Turkish government. There is Syrian, also at the north, there is a Syrian National Army, the group supported directly by Turkey. There is also Syrian Defensive Forces, supported by United States, which are mainly Kurdish forces, remnants, and last but not least, remnants of Islamic State. But Islamic State, fortunately for us, doesn't control any consistent territory, but is at the moment suppressed and limited to some partisan force and irregular forces.
Thank you very much. For me personally, I have got the picture of the factions, who wants what. I really hope that our audience has got the point too. And if you have some final remarks you'd like to make about the Middle East situation right now, you're welcome.
Just to sum up, there was a big mess, and unfortunately, it will get even more of that in the nearest future. So we have to stay tuned and observe the development of the situation.
Thank you very much. We'll contact you in the future as well to get a brief on the situation. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.
Always at your service. Thank you very much. Have a nice evening too.
Nice to meet you. Stay safe. That was Martin Krzyżanowski, an expert in the Middle East questions and an Orientalist, talking about Syria and the Middle East in our today's episode.